Okay, this lecture is about the urinary system. What is the function of the urinary system? Well, it has several functions. First of all, it regulates the water volume. It controls the amount of water in the body. It controls the blood pressure in the body. It regulates extracellular fluid concentration of ions like sodium, potassium, calcium. It balances acid-base, which is the amount of hydrogen ions in the body. Kidneys remove metabolic waste, remove toxins and drugs from the blood. The kidney has endocrine functions. There's a couple of hormones that are produced by the kidney. One is renin, which regulates blood pressure, and another is erythropoietin, which regulates red blood cell production. And the kidney functions to perform gluconeogenesis. That's the production of glucose during times of prolonged fast. There's four major organs of the urinary system that we'll talk about: the kidneys, the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the urethra. You should remember these from chapter 1 in the human torso lab. In case you don't, here's a diagram that shows where they are. Here's our kidneys. Kidneys connect to the bladder through the ureter and the urinary bladder, and the urethra goes from the bladder to the outside. Sometimes it's easy to get ureter and urethra confused. What I do to keep them straight is I think the passage of urine flows from the kidneys to the ureter, to the bladder, to the urethra. So the flow of urine goes to the ureter first and then the urethra. And it just so happens that ureter is alphabetically before urethra. So that may help you keep them straight and not get confused. The kidney anatomy. The kidney is in the retroperitoneal space. I'll show you a picture of what that is in a little bit, but it's the space under the peritoneum. Remember, peritoneum is the covering of the abdominal cavity. It's a membrane that covers the abdominal cavity. Well, the kidney's retroperitoneal is below that membrane. The right kidney is crowded by the liver, and it's a little bit lower than the left. There's adrenal glands or suprarenal glands on top of each kidney. The convex surface, convex lateral surface, and concave medial surface. So it's convex lateral surface and then a concave medial surface. And the renal hilum, which is this area here, leads to the renal sinus, and this is where the blood vessels, the lymphatics, the nerves, the ureters all enter the kidneys at the hilum. Here's what retroperitoneal is. This is the organs have been removed for this picture, but the peritoneal cavity is lined by this membrane, the peritoneal membrane. And this is looking from the person laying on the back. This is anterior, this is posterior. The kidneys are in this retroperitoneal space below the peritoneal cavity. So that's called retroperitoneal. The major vessels, the inferior vena cava, the aorta, all retroperitoneal as well. Here's the proper location of the kidneys. Are probably even with the 12th rib. The right kidney is a little bit lower because of the effect of the liver. So the liver is on the right side, and it tends to crowd the kidney out. So the kidney on the right is a little bit lower. There's a certain pattern of blood flow through the kidneys, and this diagram gives you the order of the blood flow. First of all, the aorta. The aorta is the largest vessel in the body. It comes from the heart, goes down the thoracic aorta and the abdominal aorta. And there's a branch of the aorta, you might recall from the blood vessel chapter, called the renal artery. This goes to the kidney. The renal artery, here's a picture of the renal artery here. The renal artery then splits into the segmental artery, which is illustrated here. It goes to different segments of the kidney. The segmental artery then splits off into the interlobar artery. That's this artery here. almost like different lobes of the kidney. From the interlobar artery, there's an arcuate artery. That's this artery that's kind of arched here. Think of arcuate. Think of arc. It's an arc, like a curved arch, maybe. So there's a kind of arcuate arteries, kind of arch-shaped artery here on the edge of the renal cortex and medulla. This is the cortex. This is the medulla here. We'll talk about that later, but that's on the boundary between the cortex and medulla. And then branching from the arcuate artery, there's these cortical radiate arteries. It's these arteries that radiate outward from the arcuate artery. And these are the arteries that you can see visibly. Now, as it gets smaller and smaller, you need a microscope to see. And eventually, you get small enough to get to the afferent arteriole, which goes into the glomerulus, or the capillaries of the glomerulus, and it exits to the efferent arteriole. And we'll see in a moment, the basic unit of the kidney is called a nephron. A nephron, one major part of the nephron is the glomerulus, and the glomerulus is fed by the afferent arteriole, and the blood exits the glomerulus through the efferent arteriole. And there are several capillaries that are associated with the kidney. There's the peritubular capillaries and the vasorecta capillaries. And at the end of these capillaries, then they come out to the cortical radiate vein, the arcuate vein, the interlobar vein, the renal vein, and the inferior vena cava, and then on up to the heart. The cycle repeats itself. So basically, these are veins have the same name as the arteries. Here's a close-up view of the diagram showing the arterial supply. You can follow the line to see for yourself, and look at this to be able to identify this on a chart or diagram. And here's the other part of that picture that shows a close-up view of the pathway of blood flow through the renal blood through the renal system. The nephron is the structural and functional unit of the kidneys. Remember when we talked about the nervous system? The neuron was the functional unit of the nervous system. We talked about the bones. We talked about the osteon was the functional unit of the bone system. The nephron is the functional unit of the kidneys. The nephron acts like a little miniature kidney in and of itself. The nephron filters the blood, it removes waste products, and excretes them as urine. There's about 1 million nephrons per kidney. And there's two main parts of the kidneys, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubules. There are two main parts of the nephron, renal corpuscle and renal tubules. Renal corpuscle is this first structure here. This is the purpose of the kidney is to filter the blood and to get rid of impurities from the blood. So there's going to be a close association between blood vessels and the nephron. Okay, so here shows the blood vessels going into the glomerulus. This is capillary filled inside this glomerulus. I could see the shadow of the capillaries in here. But there's a close association between the blood vessels and the nephron. This proximal portion of the nephron is the renal corpuscle. It consists of the afferent arteriole, which takes blood to the glomerulus. The glomerulus itself, which is a capillary bed inside the glomerular capsule, or filtrate formation. It's a site for filtrate formation. It differs in other capillary beds in that it drains into arterioles instead of venules. Remember how regular capillary beds, the arterioles drain the capillary bed and then they drain into a venule. In this capillary, there's a afferent arteriole that takes blood to the glomerular capillary bed, and there's an efferent arteriole that takes blood away from the glomerular capillary bed. So there's arterioles on both sides of the glomerulus. And the glomerulus is surrounded by the Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. That's so that as fluid, blood goes into the capillaries, then these capillaries are leaky, so that just about all of the particulate matter in the blood is filtered out, and it's contained within this glomerulus. And then it goes into the glomerulus, and there's a tube system. And these renal tubules are the next portion of the nephron. There's peritubular capillaries, which are actually part of the vascular system. These are the blood supply that's near the tubes, and they receive the substances that are absorbed from the renal tubules. There's a proximal convoluted tubule. This is where most of the tubular reabsorption into the peritubular capillaries occurs. Here's proximal tubule here. You could kind of in your imagination use, well, let's look at the previous slide. This is the proximal convoluted tubule here, and it goes down into a loop, a descending loop and an ascending loop. And then there's a distal convoluted tubule. Convoluted just means it's just twisted and it's got corners, and from the distal convoluted tubule, it enters into the collecting duct. So the tubule system basically is the glomerular capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct. I just went back to the other picture because it seems to show the tubule system better without showing the arteries and arterioles. This shows the same information. You got the glomerular capsule surrounding the glomerulus. The purpose of the glomerular capsule is to capture all the substances that are filtered out of the blood supply through the glomerulus, and once they're filtered out, then they start down the passageway to the proximal convoluted tubule, which is connecting to the glomerular capsule. Then this is what forms the urine is what is left over after you've filtered out of the blood. You can imagine this is a lot of blood plasma, a lot of circulating antibodies and proteins and all sorts of stuff that are in the blood gets filtered out, and they start traveling through these tubules. There's in the nephron, there's a vascular portion and there's a tubular portion, and we kind of hinted about that already. The vascular portion has to do with the blood vessels of the nephron. We're talking about the afferent arteriole, the glomerulus, the glomerular capillaries, the afferent arteriole, and the peritubular capillary. Peritubular, peri means around, like perimeter means around, like a perimeter fence is around the perimeter. Peritubular means around the tubules. So these tubes are surrounded by blood vessels called the peritubular capillaries. All that's the vascular portion. The tubular portion consists of the glomerular capsule, then the proximal convoluted tubule, going down to the nephron loop, and then the distal convoluted tubule, and then finally the collecting duct. The collecting duct is what takes, by this time, this is urine, and it goes on out to the kidneys and excreted to the urethra. These are just some of the anatomical structures inside the kidney. We can start with the ureter, kind of start from the outflow and back up. The ureter is next to the hilum of the kidney. The ureter opens up into the renal pelvis, this area here. Pelvis opens up into a major calyx, kind of like a little chamber here, major calyx. And from the major calyx, the next smallest opening would be the minor calyx. Here it shows the minor calyx. So this would be the renal pelvis here, the major calyx here, and then these are the minor calyx here. And finally, there's the renal pyramid, which is this pyramid. These pyramids look like the shape of a guitar pick, kind of round and pointed on one side. Here you see on the cartoon, it's a little bit easier to see. They look like the shape of a guitar pick. Those are the renal pyramids. and these pyramids are full of nephrons, and these nephrons are all aligned together, and they're collecting ducts form together and empty into this minor calyx, major calyx, the renal pelvis, and then out the ureter. So that's the flow of urine. The minor calyx drains the pyramids. The major calyx collects urine from the minor calyx and empties the urine into the renal pelvis. So the flow of urine goes from the renal pyramid to the minor calyx, to the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, and then out through the ureter. If you want to look at the flow of urine from the blood supply to the urethra, this is a list of the structures that the urine passes in order. First of all, the urine is basically what is filtered out of the blood. So it's going to have blood plasma, electrolytes, proteins, all that's in the blood. It's filtered out of the blood, and what's filtered out and it's excreted is what's called urine. But the flow of urine through the kidneys starts with the glomerular capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the distal convoluted tubule, the collecting duct, and that goes to the papilla of the pyramid, the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter drains into the bladder, and the bladder drains into the urethra. You'll need to know the order of urine flow. This is basically the same slide as before. It doesn't add anything new, so I won't repeat this. This just shows the structures of the kidney and structures responsible for urine flow. I put this picture here because it's kind of two ways of school of thought. If you were designing a kidney to filter the blood, you could go about it one or two ways. You could either filter the blood by taking out all the parts of the blood that you don't want, just filter them out, and then let that be what's excreted. Or you could try another way. You could filter everything out of the blood and then just put back the parts that you need. Well, our body is designed to do the second. Kidneys are designed to filter everything out of the blood, and then you just put back the parts that are necessary for life, or necessary for control of blood pressure and control of homeostasis. So that's important because when we were created, there's no way you can anticipate all of the drugs that we'll be put in our system, all the chemicals we'll be exposed to, and you don't have to have a transport mechanism for each one of those chemicals. If you filter everything out of the urine, they're going to filter out and be excreted anyway, and then you just put back into the bloodstream the parts that you need, which would be, although there's a known quantity, but you'll need to put back sodium, potassium, chloride, all the different electrolytes, put back the proteins and hormones such as that. So I use this illustration about the refrigerator to illustrate the way the function of the kidney. So if the refrigerator full of stuff, it represents the blood, full of toxins and full of proteins and full of plasma, full of all sorts of stuff flowing in the blood. First step is clean out the refrigerator. Just clean it out, and that's what happens in the glomerulus. Everything is basically filtered out of the blood, and then as the filtrate goes through the tubules, then you put back just the parts you need. So you put back just the parts that are necessary. So the resultant is a clean refrigerator. Same in the kidneys, the result is clean blood. The blood's been filtered from impurities and toxins and poisons and things that you don't want in the body. Here's a process of glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and secretion. This is kind of repeating myself, but you have the afferent arteriole, which brings blood into the glomerular capillaries. From here, good materials and bad materials are filtered out of the glomerulus. Like it says here, good materials like water, sodium, chloride, calcium, hydrogen, bicarb, glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins, even good things are all filtered out of the bloodstream in this glomerular capillary here. but bad material filters out too, like waste, nitrogen waste products. Everything's pushed out of the blood and into the glomerular capsule. From the glomerular capsule, then that fluid full of stuff that used to be in the arteries now goes down the tubules. And the second step is reabsorption. The tubule starts to reabsorb good materials that are needed for maintaining the homeostasis of the body. So the tubules can reabsorb water, sodium, chloride, the different electrolytes, glucose, fatty acids, amino acids, vitamins, things that the body needs can be brought back into the blood supply. So although it leaves the blood supply here in the glomerulus, it's re-entered the blood supply here in these peritubular capillaries. So the capillaries are near the tubules, so it's easy for them to collect the ingredients that have been filtered out. The third step is tubular secretion, which is just the opposite of tubular reabsorption. Any nitrogen waste is pulled out of the peritubular capillaries, taken into the tubular portion of the nephron. Hydrogen bicarb gets balanced by pulling excesses into the tubular portions of the nephron. So even though all this has been brought back from the tubes to the peritubular capillaries, there's also the ability to put back into the tubes things like potassium, things like hydrogen ions and bicarb to adjust acid-base balance, so to fine-tune the acid-base balance, and that's what happens with tubular secretion. So here's all three of those processes shown together. The kidney, if you look at the kidney, there's two sections of the kidney. There's the cortex and the medulla. The medulla is the inner part. Basically, these pyramids make up the medulla. The cortex is the rim, and both the cortex and the medulla are full of nephrons. Yeah, this is a picture of our nephron again. The cortex typically is what's above this line. So that would be the Bowman's capsule, the proximal convoluted tubule, the distal convoluted tubule, half the collecting ducts. The medulla contains these long loops, collecting ducts. From these long loops of the nephron and the collecting ducts those are all part of the medulla, which is deeper in the kidney. Here shows a diagram of the nephron inside the cortex and the medulla. So this is a pyramid, and you have renal cortex on the outer layer and the renal medulla inner layer. And we superimpose that with the nephron. We have a nephron showing our Bowman's capsule, proximal convoluted tubule, distal convoluted tubule, all in the cortex. And in the medulla, we have our descending loop and ascending loop and the collecting duct. All that goes through the medulla. Eventually this goes on out to the minor calyx and the major calyx, to the renal pelvis, and leaves the kidney to the ureter. There's cortical nephrons and juxtamedullary nephrons. Cortical nephrons are short nephrons that are almost entirely in the cortex. That'd be these nephrons here that just stay in the cortex. Some of them don't go all the way down into the medulla. They just stay up in the cortex. So those would be called cortical nephrons. Here's a diagram of cortical. This is a cortical nephron here. This is this glomerulus inside a short descending loop, but the whole nephron is in the cortex. That's called a cortical nephron. The juxtamedullary nephron are nephrons that go down, penetrating down into the medulla. These are long nephrons that deeply invade the medulla. These descending limbs and ascending limbs are important in the concentration of urine. This shows the cortical nephrons and the juxtamedullary nephrons. The cortical nephrons are all in the cortex, so they're all in the upper part, outer part of the kidney. The juxtamedullary nephrons have these long loops to go down into the medulla. There's three capillary beds associated with nephrons. First, we've talked about before, is the glomerulus. That's specialized capillary bed, specialized for filtration. It's different than a typical capillary bed because it's fed and drained by arterioles. It's fed by the afferent arteriole and it's drained by the efferent arteriole. There's peritubular capillaries, which are capillaries that are adapted for absorption of water and solutes. They're extensions of the efferent arterioles, the branches of the efferent arterioles, and they serve the cortical nephrons. See this picture here? These are peritubular capillaries, and they serve the cortical nephrons. The third type of capillaries is vasorecta. These are long vessels that are parallel to the long nephron loops in the juxtamedullary nephrons. They function to concentrate urine. The picture above, here's our vasorecta. These are the peritubular capillaries that are associated with the long loops that go down to the medulla. So here's the different capillaries. You have afferent arterioles going into the glomerulus, efferent arterioles. The efferent arterioles and branches and becomes part of this peritubular capillaries or the vasorecta. The process of glomerular filtration is a passive process. There's no metabolic energy required. It's all based on hydrostatic pressure forcing fluid and solutes out through the filtration membrane. This is a diagram of glomerulus. You have our afferent arteriole bringing blood into the glomerular capillaries. You have efferent arteriole bringing blood out of the glomerular capillaries. There's a pressure inside these vessels called hydrostatic pressure. Hydrostatic is just water pressure or blood pressure, basically. There's the fact that this blood pressure acts as a force to push materials outside the capillaries. So water, ions, particles floating in the arterioles are pushed out of the capillaries and are collected in this Bowman's or capsule or glomerular capsule. There's some forces that resist that motion though. There's osmotic pressure within the glomerular capillaries. So within the capillaries, there's different there's different particles that are suspended in the solution. And whenever you have particles suspended in solution, it has an osmotic pressure. That's pressure to draw water into the capillaries because there's solutes or there's particles in the capillary, and that tends to draw. Just the fact that there's particles in the vessels tends to have an osmotic pressure associated with that pulls water into the capillaries. And there's a hydrostatic pressure inside the capsular space. Okay, there's hydrostatic pressure in the arteries, but there's pressure of fluid inside the capsular space, and that tends to drive fluid back into the glomerulus. So the net filtration pressure is the result of the hydrostatic pressure minus the osmotic pressure of the glomerular capillaries minus the hydrostatic pressure of the capsular space. So there's three different forces that work here. One is a major force driving fluid out of the arterioles. Two other forces bring fluid back into the arterioles. What happens to the net filtration when hydrostatic pressure within the glomerular capillaries is increased? Well, the net filtration is increased. If the hydrostatic pressure within the capillaries is larger, then that's going to increase the net filtration. What happens to the net filtration when the hydrostatic pressure within the capsule is increased? That's going to decrease the net filtration because it opposes the net filtration. The glomerular filtration rate is the volume of filtrate, and filtrate is basically what comes out of the blood supply when it's filtered through the kidney. It's called filtrate. That's the water plus the ions and the proteins and the antibodies. Everything that's filtered out of the blood into this solution is called a filtrate. The volume of filtrate formed per minute by both kidneys is called the glomerular filtration rate. It's proportional to the net filtration rate, to the total surface area available for filtration, and to the filtration membrane permeability. The kidney can auto-regulate and maintain a constant glomerular filtration rate when the blood pressure is in a certain range. It's called renal auto-regulation. As long as the blood pressure is between 80 and 180 millimeters of mercury, auto-regulation can basically make a stable glomerular filtration rate. There's two types of renal auto-regulation: myogenic mechanism and the tubuloglomerular feedback. Of course, there's extrinsic controls that are exerted by the nervous system and the endocrine system to maintain blood pressure when arterial blood pressure drops below 80 millimeters of mercury. Let's first look at the intrinsic controls of myogenic mechanism. The myogenic mechanism, excuse me. The myogenic mechanism is based on the fact that smooth muscle contracts when stretched. It's just a property of smooth muscle. When it stretches, it tends to contract. The contraction is a response to the stretching. So let's see what happens if the blood pressure increases, and this blood pressure going into the kidneys increases. That's going to stretch the smooth muscle that surrounds the capillaries. When it stretches that smooth muscle, it's going to cause the arterioles to constrict. This constriction restricts the blood flow into the glomerulus, which protects the glomerulus from damaging high blood pressure. So it kind of keeps it within a certain range. So the increased blood pressure stretches the smooth muscle of the constrictors. That causes the arterioles to constrict and get smaller, which reduces the blood flow through the glomerulus. Same thing happens on the opposite end. When blood pressure is decreased, it's going to result in dilation of the afferent arterioles, which raises the glomerular hydrostatic pressure. These mechanisms help maintain normal net filtration pressure and glomerular filtration rate despite normal fluctuation of blood pressure. So the blood pressure can go from 80 to 180 millimeters of mercury, yet the kidneys maintain a fairly normal, stable glomerular filtration rate. Tubuloglomerular feedback is another way the kidney maintains auto-regulation. There's a juxtaglomerular apparatus that senses the increased volume inside the kidney. There's a section here called the macula densa. That's an area of the juxtaglomerular apparatus located in the ascending limb of the nephron loop. It responds to high levels of sodium in the filtrate. So when sodium is high in the filtrate, that sends messages to the afferent arterioles to constrict, which reduces blood flow to the glomerulus, which decreases the glomerular filtration rate and slows the filtrate and allows more time for sodium to reabsorb. So the trigger is high levels of sodium in the filtrate, and the response is to the tubuloglomerular feedback is that the filtrate slows down and there's more time for sodium to be reabsorbed. In other words, more time for sodium to go back from the tubes back into the blood supply to help counteract the. It slows the filtrate and allows more time for sodium to be reabsorbed back in the blood supply. So the trigger is high levels of sodium in the filtrate. The filtrate is what's filtered here. Filtrate is high of sodium. Since it's high in sodium, you want to put sodium you want to decrease the sodium in here. If it stayed high, sodium in the filtrate, you would excrete a lot too much sodium. So this way you lower the sodium by having more sodium reabsorption. When afferent arterioles constrict, or vasoconstrict, it decreases the glomerular filtration rate. Therefore, the net filtration rate is decreased, the urine output is decreased, but the systemic blood pressure remains stable. When the afferent arterioles dilate, the glomerular filtration increases, the net filtration increases, the urine output increases, but the systemic blood pressure remains stable. That's the result of the autoregulation mechanisms. Now I mentioned there's extrinsic control of the kidney. This is typically when blood pressure goes below 80 millimeters of mercury. And there's hormones that act on the kidney that influence the regulation of the kidney, influence the regulation of, and reabsorption of water and sodium. We've talked about this before when we talked about the endocrinology section. There's aldosterone, works in the distal convoluted tubules to reabsorb more sodium. Now, sodium is a solute, S-O-L-U-T-E, solute, and it's when it's mixed in with water, it's part of a solution. And just like sodium exerts an osmotic pressure. When it's a solid in a solution, it exerts an osmotic pressure. The more sodium there is, the more it draws water into that area. So therefore, aldosterone reabsorbs more sodium. That sodium is followed by water. This sodium is going from the convoluted tubules to being reabsorbed back out in the bloodstream. The water follows, and there's more water going in the bloodstream. Therefore, the blood volume and the blood pressure is increased because the sodium and the water are leaving the distal convoluted tubules and going back into the capillaries and the bloodstream. The other hormone, antidiuretic hormone, remember this is produced by the pituitary gland. This works in the collecting ducts to increase permeability to water so that more water gets reabsorbed. So you have the water that's in the collecting ducts, and with ADH, more water is reabsorbed. If more water is reabsorbed from the collecting ducts back into the blood volume, so therefore blood volume and therefore blood pressure is increased. And renal angiotensin, when blood pressure drops below 80 millimeters of mercury, the juxtaglomerular cells produce renin. Renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin, which causes systemic vasoconstriction. It stimulates ADH and aldosterone production. It stimulates thirst. All this have the net effect of increasing blood volume and blood pressure increase. This next slide you might find familiar. This is when we cover the hormones, and when we discuss ADH and renal. We'll discuss renin when we talk about I think in the endocrine chapter. This shows the effects of renin. When arterial blood pressure gets low, it results in increased renin released from the kidneys. That triggers a set of reactions. It changes angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. That's transferred to angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has 4 different effects. It causes the adrenal cortex to secrete aldosterone, which increases sodium reabsorption by the kidneys. And that the volume of the water is going to follow the sodium, and therefore more water is going to go into the bloodstream, which will increase the blood volume. Angiotensin 2 increases ADH release by the posterior pituitary. That's going to cause reabsorption of water to be increased by the kidneys, so therefore more water is going from the kidneys into the blood, increasing blood volume. Angiotensin 2 causes you to be more thirsty, so you drink more water, increase water intake, or increase blood volume. Angiotensin 2 causes vasoconstriction and increased peripheral resistance, which is going to increase the blood pressure. So the angiotensin 2 has 4 different functions, but the net effect of all 4 of these is going to increase blood volume and therefore increase the arterial blood pressure. So this is a way of regulating the blood pressure. The trigger for all this is a decreased blood pressure. When the blood pressure is decreased, it basically stimulates renin, which stimulates the production of angiotensin II, which has all these effects that basically increase the blood pressure. So it's a homeostasis process. It's a way of maintaining a normal blood pressure. When blood pressure goes down, it's a way of getting the blood pressure back up. Now, urine can be either concentrated or dilute, and all that has to do with the antidiuretic hormone. Remember, the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, increases permeability of water so that more water gets reabsorbed back into the blood. So blood volume and blood pressure is increased. If you overhydrate, if you drink too much and you overhydrate, it's going to result in a large volume of dilute urine because you're trying to get rid of some excess fluid. ADH production is reduced and more urine is produced, and this urine is dilute. It's not concentrated, it's dilute. And that helps to rid the body of the overhydration. If you're dehydrated, then your urine is going to be a small volume. It's going to be very concentrated urine. And that's because ADH production is increased and produces less urine, and that urine that's produced is more concentrated. So the ADH is adjust the concentration of the urine to make it either dilute or very concentrated. Here's a diagram that shows actions of ADH. Here's ADH on the pituitary. It affects the blood vessel. It causes vasoconstriction of the blood vessel. ADH affects the kidneys to reabsorb more water. The net effect of all this is increased blood volume and increased blood pressure. Renal clearance. The kidneys filter substances out of the bloodstream. Sometimes you might want to know how efficient the kidneys are at filtering particles out of the bloodstream. That's where renal clearance comes in. Renal clearance is the volume of plasma that the kidneys can clear of a particular substance in a given time. Renal clearance tests can be used to determine glomerular filtration rate. This can detect glomerular damage or follow the progress of renal disease. There's a formula. Renal clearance, represented by C, is equal to the concentration of the substance in the urine, whatever. This could be glucose or whatever, glucose or sodium, whatever you're measuring. Let's say if it's sodium, it'd be the concentration of sodium in the urine divided by the concentration of sodium in the plasma, multiplied times the flow rate of urine formation. That product gives you the renal clearance of sodium. Here's an example of urea. Urea is a product of protein degradation. It's a waste product. It's a major component of urine. If the urea concentration in urine is 6 milligrams per milliliter, the flow rate of urine formation is 2 milliliters per minute, and the concentration of urea in plasma is 0.2 milligrams per milliliter. Plug that into the equation, the renal clearance of urea is going to turn out to be 60 milliliters per minute. That means the kidney is filtering 60 milliliters of urea per minute. Now, there's several things that can show up in the urine that are not necessarily normal and might represent disease. And this is a list of some of those. And if you have too much glucose in the urine, which you see with diabetes mellitus, glucose is in the bloodstream and glucose is filtered out of the urine. It's glycosuria. The glucose in the urine, glycosuria. It actually gives the urine a sweet taste to it, if you were to taste it, that is. Urine can also have protein. That's referred to proteinuria or albuminuria. Remember, albumin is the major plasma protein. Albuminuria is excessive albumin in the urine. This could be a result of excessive physical exercise, pregnancy, or glomerulonephritis, which is an injury to the filtration mechanism of the kidneys. In starvation or untreated diabetes mellitus, you have ketone bodies that are in abundance in the urine, in the bloodstream, and that gets filtered out to the kidneys, and it causes ketonuria. You have hemoglobinuria. When you have hemoglobin that gets filtered out and it's in the urine. This is seen with hemolytic anemia, severe burns, bilirubinuria. In liver disease, you have bile. It gets backed up in the bloodstream and that gets filtered out into the urine. So if there's a lot of bile in the urine, the bilirubinuria is. You actually have blood in the urine. Hematuria is blood in the urine. This is the erythrocytes in the urine. You see this in the case of if the urinary tract has been injured, like from a kidney stone, and you have bleeding inside the urinary tract, that can cause hematuria. Pyuria is the presence of pus or leukocytes, white blood cells in the urine. You see this like if you have urinary tract infection with a lot of white blood cells and pus in the urine, that causes pyuria. All right, let's move out of the kidneys and continue down the urinary system. Out of the kidneys, we enter the ureter. The ureters are basically a passageway that conveys urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The ureters are also retroperitoneal. They enter the bladder wall to the posterior wall of the bladder. There's 3 layers of the ureter wall from inside to out. There's a mucosal, which is made of transitional epithelium. Remember, transitional epithelium is epithelium that can stretch. It lines the bladder and the ureters and the urethra. It's transitional epithelium. Is the inner layer. The muscularis is a smooth muscle layer which contracts in response to stretch. It propels urine into the bladder. And the adventitia is outer fibrous connective tissue surrounding the outside of the ureters. Now moving to the bladder. The bladder is a muscular sac that's used to temporarily store urine. It's also retroperitoneal. In males, the prostate is inferior to the bladder next. The prostate will be down here. In females, it's anterior to the vagina and the uterus. There's openings for the ureters and the urethra. The trigone is a triangular area outlined by the openings for the ureters and the urethra. Here in this picture you have the openings for the ureter, left right ureter here, and the urethra here. If you connect those three points, that's called a trigone. Urine drains into the bladder here. It fills up the bladder and it excretes out of the bladder to the ureter, to the urethra. Bladder wall. 3 layers of bladder wall. There's the mucosal layer, which is made of transitional epithelial mucosa. Remember, transitional epithelial stretches. That allows the bladder to stretch when full of urine. Then there's a layer of smooth muscle, just like in the ureters. There's 3 layers. There's 3 layers in the bladder. The second layer is layers of smooth muscle, like see here. And the outer layer is the fibrous adventitia. This would be fibrous material here on the outer layer of the bladder. The urinary bladder can collapse when empty, and rugae appear. Rugae are wrinkles or folds, very similar to like what you see in the stomach. There's those wrinkles or folds in the stomach, and same in the bladder. A full bladder can hold about 500 milliliters. The bladder can burst if it's overextended. The stretching of the bladder wall is a trigger for the voiding reflex. So when the bladder wall stretches, you reflexively want to urinate. Now finally, the urethra is the tube draining the urinary bladder. The lining epithelium is mostly pseudostratified columnar epithelium. It's in the urethra is pseudostratified columnar epithelium. But the portion near the bladder is made of a transitional epithelium, because the bladder's epithelium is transitional epithelium. So the first part of the urethra is transitional epithelium. And on the other end of the urethra, towards the external opening, is stratified squamous epithelium, just like on the skin is stratified squamous epithelium. So in between either end of the urethra, there's pseudostratified columnar epithelium. So there's 3 different types of epithelium in the urethra. There's urethral sphincter. There's an internal sphincter and an external sphincter. The internal sphincter is involuntary and it's smooth muscle. At the bladder urethral junction, it contracts to open. The external urethral sphincter is voluntary, it's skeletal muscle. It surrounds the urethra as it passes through the pelvic floor. This is what gives you a voluntary control of your urine. Here shows the internal urethral sphincter and the external urethral sphincter. Here is external urethral sphincter is like a circular muscle that surrounds, and when it contracts, it closes off the urethra and blocks the urine passage. When you get to where you go to the bathroom, this muscle relaxes and urine can flow outside the bladder. This is the female. The next is the male. Have the bladder. Here's the prostate inferior to the bladder. The urethra of the male is longer, goes through the penis and to the outside, to the external urethral orifice.